Hi, everybody. This is the lecture for Unit 6. Our topic is abortion. So this is one of the hot topics that we'll be getting into now. So the reality is that you and I, we all have positions on this particular topic. That should not only be expected, it should be anticipated and in very many ways welcomed. If somebody said they had no position whatsoever on abortion and thereby, because they are indifferent to this topic, would be the best to decide, I would find that odd. One, how is it that you have no position on such a steep, let's say, moral and civic, or at least civil issue within the United States? Where have you been? It'd be like saying I have no position on racism, therefore I can decide who is or who's not racist. How could you not have a position on something that is central to much of the debates that are going on in our country about, as we will see, the human person? So the reality is this is not about the positions that we take. We are going to try to do our best to have a disinterested view towards this. And by disinterested, I do not mean that you are not to have some sort of passion or even zeal for your position. It's just that we have to make sure that we are approaching this in a particular fashion as philosophers. So we're going to look at the arguments and we're going to look at what's available to us and see what the parameters are and move on from there, okay? So also, too, the terms pro-life and pro-choice are really not going to help us much here. They are slogans, and anybody who studies philosophy and in philosophy logic realizes that slogans are inherently vague, and they typically allow people to fall into some sort of fallacy. What does it really mean to say that somebody is pro-life? Now, maybe in terms of abortion, we know what that means, but are you for or against the death penalty? That's life too. Are you for or against a woman who might be struggling with the decisions she's trying to make with her body? That's life too. For a person who says they're pro-choice, what exactly does that mean? In terms of abortion, we know what it means, but does it encompass other choices that people make and the autonomy of their body? And is it only women that have that sort of autonomy? So we're just going to avoid those labels altogether. And I like how your text actually calls them rhetorical descriptors, right? So we're just going to avoid using them. We're also going to say, well, these positions are pretty hotbed issues where you have individuals in various camps. So aren't they, let's say, if you are an abortion advocate, or if you are a person opposed to abortion, are these de facto opposites? And where would be the compromise? Well, let's just say that, when we enter into dialogue on things like this, the idea of compromise is not always what we're after. Dialogue doesn't have to result in compromise. To play off of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who would talk about like the outside of the inside, so if there are things on the like ideas and concepts and dialogues you have with those on the outside, it could be to change your mind, but it also could help people on the inside reframe their arguments and understand them more deeply. So, there's always a reason to be in dialogue with those people that we disagree with, even if we think that typically these people are not reasonable. As long as they're willing to be in dialogue, oftentimes they can show us things on our own inside position or the claims that we're making from the group that we are on the inside, that there are particular things that either we have discovered in dialogue with them that they were latent in our own particular beliefs, or they're just simply unrealized. So my point just in that was to make certain that there's always a reason for dialogue as long as a person is willing to be reasonable and civil, all right? And the goal doesn't mean that we're going to compromise or you're going to agree with me or I'm going to agree with you. It helps us reframe our own understandings of the issue, and it also gives us some sort of context as to whether or not we might rediscover certain things that we've kind of left to the side in our own arguments. All right. So anyway, I said we're going to talk about this from a disinterested point of view. And again, that does not mean you shouldn't have passion or conviction. But as we come into these hot topics, and this probably is the first one that we're getting into, we have to make sure that if we're in discussion with somebody, and I know even in an online course, maybe it doesn't sound as right, but if we're in discussion with somebody on these issues, we don't let them speak, and while they're speaking, we're just simply trying to already formulate how we're going to respond. A dialogue includes listening, and includes understanding. And oftentimes, if you're able to repeat, or even if you're able to summarize the person's point, that not just demonstrates to them that you're listening, but it also demonstrates to yourself that you understand their point. So if you do disagree, you could disagree with what they honestly believe and not just simply some caricature of what their beliefs, like because they belong to that group and this is what you think of that group and you throw them in. All right. So anyway, also too, I want to be very clear, a lot of preliminary stuff here, right? Let's be very clear that the argument is not won by the person who is the most mad, right? The veracity of our argument is not, and by veracity, I mean the truth of our argument, it is not determined by the person who has the most moral outrage. We don't stop talking because we're afraid to get them more mad. And just because somebody starts, yelling and makes a stance doesn't mean they're right. It could be that they're just getting so emotional that the talking has to cease for a while, okay? So anyway, by the way, that's the kind of crap you see on the news. So just turn the news off. You're not being informed. You're just hearing some divisions. We're not as divided as the news industry will allow us to believe, because they're more interested in ratings, because ratings bring them revenue. My cynicism view will be another time on that. All right, so to the issue, let's talk about what type of abortions we're talking about. Your book talks about, spontaneous abortions. We're typically known as miscarriages. We're going to leave that alone. A miscarriage could have moral culpability, like if the woman was damaged, if the woman was injured, like, thrown down the steps or such, or even if she did self-harm, something to cause the actual miscarriage. There's moral culpability there. Or if she abused her body, say with alcohol, drugs, and such, and then that caused some sort of miscarriage. But let's just leave that to the side. We can't solve everything, and that's probably better to deal with another time. We're also going to, I'll give a brief discussion on it, but we're not going to talk about ensoulment so much. Now, the book, your online text, talked about ensoulment being a theological aspect. Well, you can be an atheist and still believe that there's some sort of, animation to the human person known as a soul. You may see a little bit different, but that could be a pagan notion also. And I use pagan in the ancient frame of mind. But I did want to say something about Aquinas. And this is a little bit of a biology lesson. This is not a science class. I know some of you are in the nursing program, so this might be of interest to you. But the reality is that Thomas Aquinas did understand the life of the child to begin at what was known as quickening. Okay, so when the child was felt to move within the woman's womb, then it was animated, which comes from the root word anima. Anima is the Latin word for soul. So it was assumed at that point that this child has come alive. In the ancient world, they did not have the modern understanding of fertilization and conception as we have today. So, I'm not going into a literal lineal history of this, but it could be that they understood that there's something came from nothing. There was almost like this growth that may not or may have been connected to sex. Sex wasn't always absolutely connected with conception. They might have gotten that from, say, the animal kingdom and such, but not every sex act ends in a pregnancy, so it's hard to say how they totally understood it. There is some knowledge that they thought the man contained all of what was necessary for the life of the child, and by that it was because the man's seed. The word semen, again, is just another Latin word for seed. So that the seed was then implanted in the woman, and the woman became then like the I don't want to just say carrier, but the vessel who then brought this child to term. Now, as archaic as that sounds to us, it's not unreasonable. I mean, this is how people plant seeds in the grounds for fruit trees to grow and such, or vegetables. So you could see where that came from. It wasn't probably until like the 17th century, and I'm saying this because you have to understand how modern in the course of human history, even written human history, our understanding of conception and fertilization is. As a matter of fact, they didn't even really call it conception at that point. They're really just talking about it in terms of what was the word I want to use? It doesn't matter. I'll think of it in a second. But when they started to understand that a woman has ovum, and that a man, and won't give you his name, it's like a Dutch name, who also saw spermatozoa underneath the microscope, and then they understood, at least not maybe the connection between the spermatozoa and the ovum, but they understood like the spermatozoa as something that was alive prior to entering the woman. It sounds a little weird, but almost like a parasitic notion, like where this child would then generate. That was the word. They wouldn't call it conception, would generate from that. It wasn't probably until the 19th century till we have what is now our modern biological notion of conception, that the sperm and the egg come together. So we're pretty recent here. We're only talking like 150 years that we have, where theory matched up with the experiments, and they can actually have some proof to what they said. So, to say that Thomas Aquinas had a different understanding of when life began, it's a little anachronistic, okay? It's not quite fair to go back and say that to an historical figure. It'd be like criticizing Plato, saying, Copernicus changed, their mind on I'm sorry, you could say, well, Plato had one idea on how the universe was and Copernicus had another. They're so far apart in time, it's not quite fair to compare the two. So we'll leave it. That's all I wanted to say about ensoulment. Just a little bit that I'm trying to add that the book didn't quite get to. All right. So let's talk about the definition of life. Now, I don't like how the textbook kind of mixed up the term life and personhood. I want to leave the term life in the purely biological science realm. All right. So we're talking cell division. So life begins when you have not just new DNA, right, but when you have cell division. So that we would call that the moment of fertilization. Now, that's not to sway this argument one way or another. As you can see, as you will see, that does not settle the issue. All right. So I don't think it's controversial to say life begins at fertilization, because, well, I'll leave it for now, but you'll see what I mean on that in a second. Little side note. That was typically held as the case, that life begins at fertilization. In the early 2000s, the American Medical Association, and you can fact check all of this, right? Because I want to make sure I'm giving it to you right. But I've been teaching this stuff for, probably as old as some of you are, 20 years. The reality is this, they changed the definition of pregnancy, right? So pregnancy was always determined by fertilization. Even if we didn't quite know the exact day, right? You would take 2 weeks from the last period and such, and they would come up and say, well, this is when we think that you became pregnant, and then 9 months from that, they come up with a due date. But in the early 2000s, the American Medical Association changed the term of pregnancy from fertilization to implantation. And this was specifically because the Plan B emergency contraception that was at that time now being given over the counter, so it was OTC, it was known that it would suppress ovulation, but it also had the function of being hostile to implantation. So that could be what we would term a spontaneous abortion, as long as we understand abortion to mean the termination of a fetal life. So because that's controversial, and it's kind of tricky, just in wordplay, the AMA changed the definition of pregnancy from fertilization to implantation. Therefore, then they did not need to recognize, nor did they need to have a disclosure that Plan B could be an abortifacient. So a little bit of an aside, but that's how things are. People are tricky. Okay, so let's see. So if we're going to say that life begins at fertilization, which is a fair enough thing to say as a biological fact, we can't refer to the fetus as a future potential life. It already is a life. Everything in ethics has to be like what a thing is. We start with the ontology. Well, what is it? So if somebody says it's a future life, we're going to have the hard time saying, but what is it now? And if we can't say what it is now, then we know that we have an issue, okay? So that aside, it's also not controversial to say this is a human life. I mean, it can't be a potential human. I mean, human is the only essence that it has. It's not going to be a giraffe. It's not going to be a tomato plant, right? As silly as that sounds, it's not that controversial. And this doesn't matter which side of the issue that you're on. It's not controversial to say that fertilization is the beginning of human life. Now, I understand that some people still will argue that. I'm not trying to settle that here. I'm just telling you it's not where I see the major argument has gone. And I've been in these discussions for, decades. So the issue then, what really is the contention is personhood. Now we are squarely in the philosophical realm. That's also in a theological realm, but we're not doing any dogmatic stuff here. So in the philosophical realm, we have to determine when does personhood occur. And you might be surprised to learn, let's say, that philosophers who are advocates for abortion think that the present legal term in the United States, that personhood occurs at birth, is absurd. So people who are for it or against it in the philosophical realm find that to be so arbitrary that it's almost not worth debating, all right? So Before I do this, though, just a real quick legal background. It didn't talk about this in your book, and I think it's important for you to make some informed decisions as you moved on here. So abortion in the United States, although there was legal issues that, had wrangled around a little bit prior to Roe v. Wade in 1973, that really is the seminal court ruling, okay? So Wade was the Attorney General for the state of Texas, and Roe was Norma McCory. She had just passed away not too long ago. She had no idea that she was Roe. So this was not done really, well, I can't say it wasn't done on her behalf. It was done unbeknownst to her. So she was used as a test case, although she had absolutely no part in it. She was actually, ironically, a pro-life advocate. But that's, you can study about that on your own, look it up. But what this ruling did, and I'm not going to go into any depth, it did overturn whatever states disallowed abortions in the first trimester, okay? There was some nuanced understandings of state rights as far as the second and third trimester, but it's where we come up with the legal identity that personhood exists outside the womb. That's why I'm bringing this up. On that same day in Georgia was Doe v. Bolton, okay? Now, the Doe was actually Sandra Cano, who herself also did not know that this case was filed on her behalf. As a matter of fact, she didn't know, nor was it disclosed to her until 2003, that this was actually on her behalf. What that did was the decision that gave us what we understand as life of the mother. So when you hear terms like, well, I'm against abortion except for cases of life of the mother, that's not a clear term. Philosophers cannot stand vague and unclear terms. Most people, just the average person, hears life of the mother, they hear this person's going to die. So let me read to you exactly how they ruled in this, okay? Let's see. When one uses life of the mother, okay, here it is, that the medical judgment may be exercised in the light of all factors. So we're talking about life, like what does life encompass? The life of the mother will encompass physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the woman's age. These are all relevant to her well-being as a patient. So you can advocate for that, okay, but just make sure that you understand life of the mother isn't that she's going to die. It could be that she has too many children at home and this is going to put an undue burden. Okay, so that may not change a person's position on being an advocacy, but it should at least change your understanding of what it means as life of the mother. All right, so back to philosophy and personhood. There's not a lot of differing camps on this, as you might suspect. I've been through so many arguments on this, I'm telling you it boils down to two. I know the book presents some nuances, and all those are true, but this really boils down to two. So I'm not trying to make it a black and white issue, but I'm trying to say that these are the two strongest positions. All the other ones, I think a decent philosopher can dismantle those fairly easy. All right, so the one position is that personhood is tethered to sentiency, right? The rationality. So until there's some sort of self-awareness, we cannot call this a person. So they separate the idea of personhood from the human species, right? So Peter Singer, the bioethicist from Princeton University, is famous for promoting this. What he says is that, look, it may be a little, he doesn't say this, but paraphrasing, it's a little cringeworthy to think, but to say that personhood begins at birth, which is arbitrary because birth changes, right? The reality is that personhood occurs at self-awareness. And you're talking about the 5th month post-uterine. So we're talking a 5-month-old child. And he believes that up until that point, we do not have a person, even though we do have a human life. So there is no ethical qualms in extinguishing like that. Now, we would hear that as infanticide, and he recognizes that. But he's also very consistent. I mean, that is a very clear and hard position and an arguable one to have. It also fits very well with his advocacy and others' advocacy for euthanasia. In other words, at what point does a person lose their concept of personhood? We might say in normal terms, they're no longer there. Well, should that person be either voluntarily or involuntarily euthanized? It's very consistent there. So it's a very strong case to argue. And I don't think that it should be dismissed so easily, all right? As like, well, that's barbaric. Nonetheless, if you think it is barbaric, you're going to have to come up with a better definition of personhood. Now, on the other side of the debate, you're going to say that personhood exists from the very beginning of biological life. Now, why is that a strong position? because you're not separating personhood from any human life. You are basically saying every human life is a person. And if you're going to separate personhood from human life, like Peter Singer, you're going to have to say when and be consistent. And I'm telling you now, at birth, even though that's what's legal in the United States, that's never going to hold water in a philosophical argument. So you're going to have to come up with something else. So in this case, they're saying that we can never conceive of a human being that is not a person. And that would then also be, brought to the end where it would affect a person's understanding, at least of involuntary euthanasia. It could, still leave room for voluntary euthanasia, depending on the situation. But the further claim is, and then I'm off this, is that if we're going to start determining who is not a person based on certain criteria, sentency, it always is going to fall poorly on those who are powerless and cannot speak for themselves. It has not gone well for us, say these advocates in the past, when those who are in power, have determined for those who are weak, who is not a person. And we don't want to see that just migrate into something else, particularly in the abortion debate. All right. So anyway, now we're not going to settle the issue here. Sorry again for going a little longer than I want. This is something you're going to have to work out on your own, right? But with all the ethical considerations, regardless of the sides, there are still parameters that you have to stay within in your arguments. So you're going to have to say, what is the ontological status of this unborn, right? If you're an advocate, you're going to have to make the case that this is a human person. If you are an advocate for abortion, you're going to have to make the case that the ontological status is something other. It's part of the argument, all right? And you're also, if you're going to make the case, say that a woman has autonomy to her body, which is, a valid argument, you're going to have to show the limits of that autonomy and how it applies to the abortion issue. If that makes you uncomfortable, there's already limits on everybody's autonomy of their body. Neither male nor female can, sell a kidney. We cannot self-harm ourselves, right? There are laws in place that do not allow us to have full autonomy in our bodies. So how does that relate? You'll have to work out that in the framework, right? So we're trying to be philosophers here, and a decent philosopher is going to always talk with very specific terms. So when we use terms like life, human, person, etc., we are going to have to make sure that they are clear and unambiguous and used, equivocally throughout our arguments, so we're not changing it. Otherwise, we can really get trapped. We're also going to have to develop propositions. Are they true or are they not true? Like, for instance, all biological humans are person. That would be a proposition in support of the, I say, against the abortion position. Or if you were to say the proposition, some biological humans are person, that would be those who are an advocate for abortion, depending on what stage and such. Once you have your terms, once you have your propositions, then you construct an argument, and your argument is valid or not. Arguments are not true and false, they are simply valid or not. But so you work this out, and then you come up and you present this with passion, but in a disinterested, philosophical way, and always in a manner of respect to the other person. All right? Okay, ciao all.